do this because you guys show up. So I thank you guys for showing up every Saturday live with me for this training. So thank you. Typically, when you're working on projects as a BA or a PM or, QA, whatever role you have on a project, it's really, really important that you understand that there's always 3 different environments that you're going to be working in, right? So when you gather your requirements from your stakeholders and you hand them off to your software developer, they're going to be in the dev environment, right? This is where they're coding and, programming the requirements that you've gathered from your stakeholders. Then you have a testing. So once our developers are done coding and they're done doing unit testing to make sure that what they have coded works from their best point of view, then they move it into the test environment. This is where our QA folks go in and they, they test either manually or automated testing to make sure that everything that's been coded based on the requirements works. So let's say if they find a bug or a defect, then things are moved back into the dev environment for the developers to go back and fix, and then they move it back into test. UAT also happens most of the time in test environment. And then once everybody is satisfied, right, with what we have gathered in the requirements and what they're testing or seeing, the output, then it's released into the production environment. So the reason why I wanted to start with the different environments for change management is, as you can imagine, any change that comes while we're in the development, in the dev environment, it's going to be relatively cheaper than when we find those issues in the prod environment, right? Because once we're in the prod environment, we're live, right? The system is functional, our end users are on it. So it becomes really, really difficult and really costly for us to find, or when changes come in, even in the test or in the prod environment, because it's kind of too late at that point. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we're finding issues, even before we have our developers start coding, is the optimal solution. But in any case, it's way more expensive in the prod or even in the test than it is in the dev environment. So it's important for us to understand these 3 pillars, which BAs don't usually see, but it's for you to completely understand change management. This is where I always like to start off, so that you have like a framework of why changes are so critical the further they come along in the project lifecycle. Okay. So typically a change request, if you guys don't have like a formal change request process at, wherever you're working, typically this is how it should happen, like the theoretical, the book knowledge way, right? You're supposed to have a change control board, which is the CCB here that I've mentioned. The change control board is made up of individuals, right, that have the authority to approve that change. So they could be the project sponsor, the manager of our programming team, the manager of our QA team, the project manager, and other key stakeholders, right? Typically, you want an odd number of people on the change control board to vote, right? Because if you have even number like 2 versus 2, you really can't move forward from there. So typically, they like to have an odd number of people. But usually, this is how it really happens, you guys. So let's say a change request comes in and it's assessed typically by the PM, and then they work with the project sponsor or like the key stakeholders to really understand that change request. Like, why is it so critical and why wasn't it identified when we were gathering the requirements? But in any scenario, let's say if the change is critical enough and we want to go ahead as a company and make that decision to make that change, right? Then we need to go back and assess the impact of that change, because any change that comes in after the requirements have been finalized, right? Let's say requirements are finalized and coding hasn't started, then there may not be that big of an impact, right? But there will be an impact, but not probably as big of an impact if you found that or you discovered that change later on in the process, as I was talking about earlier. So let's say requirements are signed off, but our programmers haven't started testing. So that there may be an impact based on like just timelines, but maybe not, there's not enough rework that would be substantial for us to be, cautious about this project going forward. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So in the book, like the theoretical way, the change request comes in, it's assessed by the change control board. You assess the input, like on the time, scope, and budget, and the change is either approved or denied, and then you communicate the results of that change to everybody on the team. So that's like the usual way how change comes in. And in this slide, what I try to do is give you guys an understanding of the time that the change is coming in, the process that the change control board would take, and what the next steps are. So let's say a change would typically never come in the planning or the analysis, because that's where you're gathering the requirements. Changes could come in typically in the design, um, during the implementation or the testing phase, right? And what I'm talking about here is the waterfall scenario, but this applies to Agile as well. The only difference with Agile, as changes come in, they come in either as defects or new requirements on the product backlog, which is then prioritized and moved into upcoming sprints if the items on the product backlog are prioritized high enough.
Could you just go over it one more time?
Okay, so when we talk about change management in the waterfall scenario, we're following this approach because projects in the waterfall environment take a lot longer to complete, right? Like you're spending maybe 3 months, 2 to 3 months in planning, in analysis, and then you're giving your developers 2 or 3 months to code, and then you have your testers. So the reason why we have to go back in the waterfall environment to assess changes in time, scope, and budget is because everybody has spent so much time in each of the phases to write out the requirements, right? So if now a new change comes back, all teams that have worked on those requirements have to go back and understand what that impact is, right?
Mhm.
When we're in the agile environment and we have changes that come in, they come in either as defects when we're demoing like so let's say we have a 2-week sprint and we are now doing a demo to our product owner and our stakeholders. And they say that, okay, well, this is great, but we want something additional. So that's a change, right? It's change that we didn't understand or anticipate. So that change could either be a defect or it could be a new requirement that goes back to the product backlog. The product backlog is where you have all of your requirements either at a high level or fleshed out. So when a change goes into the product backlog, then you work with your product owner to prioritize everything based on everything that's on your product backlog. You prioritize what's important, and based on the importance of what you just added and everything else that's already there, then you move those work items into each of the sprints. Does that make sense? Okay.
All of them agree. So when and where all of them agree?
So when we're talking about the agile environment, when we have the demo, typically the product owner attends and our stakeholders attend. So let's say if the sprint is for me, this sprint has like some marketing features that we're going to release. So the product owner will invite me because I'm head of marketing, for example, let's just say, right? And I see the demo and I'm like, okay, well, that's great, but I want this other functionality as well. That's when the product owner and that me as a marketing person will go offline and sit and talk about what I want, right? Once that is decided between the stakeholder and the product owner, then the product owner will add that to the product backlog. And then based on everything that you have on the product backlog, it's prioritized. So these are called product backlog grooming sessions
Yeah.
Yes, grooming sessions between the product owner and their stakeholders.
Okay, and when they talk, Where will they talk? Is it, do they talk in sprint review meeting? You said product owner
No.
and the, so it's different meeting only
Yeah.
between them.
Okay, so in the waterfall environment, the project manager and BA go out and get the requirements, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Uh, so in the waterfall environment, the project manager and the BAs typically go out, have the relationships with the stakeholders, and gather requirements. In the agile environment, our product owner typically has those relationships with the stakeholders. The scrum master may help, in gathering those requirements and whatnot, but typically the product owner is interfacing with the stakeholders and is responsible for identifying the end-to-end scope of the project. So if, let's say, if me as a marketing person come up with like a whole new thing that I want that wasn't part of the scope, then the product owner would come back to me and say, well, Sarbjeet, I understand you want this right now, but you know, based on speed to market, based on what we want to accomplish by the end of whatever, we are not going to add that. Or, of course, that makes sense. Let's add it to the product backlog, right? That those are the kind of conversations that are done outside of like the agile team, because you don't want your developers and you don't want your scrum master to be involved in these types of discussions unless something's been approved for the project.
Okay. Because what I know that everything in the product backlog doesn't go all the way at the end. It's just depend on
Based on
prioritization
our,
and
yeah,
time. So
yeah,
it doesn't
based on,
matter how many requirements we have in that. So sometimes the change management they come, well, there is no change management. Sometimes the business asks for something and they do add it to the product backlog, but it never move it way to the end
yeah,
product.
it depends on what your relationships are, right? Adding stuff to the product backlog for just adding stuff to the product backlog doesn't make sense, right?
Okay.
Um, but if you're in an environment where you need, if like the stakeholders say they want something and it needs to get added, like for political reasons they may add it, but from my standpoint, if it doesn't make sense, then don't add it, don't clutter the product backlog.
Okay, so we as a BA, we have a very minimum say in the change requirement in Agile.
Even in the waterfall, as a BA, you have very little say on what gets added. Your job is to understand what we're delivering, and if the business comes back to you and say, hey, I want this change, your job as a BA is to assess that change, and if that change request is approved, your job is to go back to your requirements, to update the requirements, have requirements traceability to make sure that the new requirements are now part of the baseline, and you work, to identify the change in scope, the time, and the budget and whatnot.
Sorry, you just mentioned about the traceability here. I have just a bit of a question, off topic question here. Do we do RTM in Agile as well?
No.
So how do we trace? This question has been asked to me in an interview, that how do we trace a requirement in the Agile?
So Jira, right? So
Yeah,
in the waterfall environment, we could have requirements that are in Word documents, in Excel spreadsheets, in like, whatever, in a tool as well,
yeah.
right? But in the waterfall environment, you're typically not managing requirements in a tool. You can, or you could also be managing your requirements in an Excel spreadsheet. So that's why requirements traceability becomes really, really important. In the agile environment, you're typically using tools such as Jira, right? Or
Jira.
any other tool to make
Which has
sure
ticket
that,
numbers.
yeah, ticket numbers,
Yeah.
and then you move something from the product backlog, then it goes into the sprint backlog, then it
Yeah.
is something that you're working on actively, then it's handed over to a tester, then it's handed to a developer. So you see the progression of requirements from the product backlog to until it's delivered.
Okay.
And that's been, again, you guys, I am not the expert. I only teach you what I've practiced so far in my 15 years of career, as well as what I've taught to, people like you and have become successful. So, I won't ever say that I'm the expert. What I teach you is what I've practiced.
Okay, so what would have been the right answer? Okay, we do not need requirement traceability metrics in Agile because we have taken numbers.
So the right answer would have been, in my experience on my projects, this is how I've managed it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, going back to change management, you guys. We only have an hour today together because I have my other session with the people that have signed up for the live project right after this. So going back to the change management process, the only distinction between Agile and the Waterfall is it's a little bit less, I guess it's a little bit easier to accommodate changes in the Agile because, again, for Agile, you're in a environment where, these things are expected. Changes do happen, things do get prioritized, right? And that's why Agile environment is preferred over Waterfall because, in Waterfall, you have to define everything before it moves on to the next phase. And in Agile, you have the ability to make those changes faster and, you kind of fail fast. So if our developers have spent 1 or 2 weeks creating something and it's not what the business needed, we only lost those 2 weeks, as opposed to in Waterfall, if changes come in, like when we're testing, which is the first time we get to see stuff, we may have wasted 4 or 5 months of everybody's time, right? So that's the reason why changes are a little bit easier to accept in Agile than they are in Waterfall. And that's why in Waterfall, you have like this whole process that you have to follow to assess those changes and make sure that everybody, including the business, along with the dev teams, along with the QA teams, are going to be able to accept these changes. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So what this slide shows you is the impact of changes, and depending on the phase that they come into us, what that means for our BAs, right? So let's say in the planning and analysis, you typically don't have anything. So in the design, let's say we have a change request that's been identified by a subject matter expert. The BA will create the change request and submit to project manager typically, right? Oops, sorry. The project manager will submit the change request to the change control board. The change control board evaluates the impact of the change request on the project, and they communicate the decision made by the change control board. So what that means is, let's say a change comes in, our BAs will typically write up the change request, and they will assess the impact and they'll submit it to the PM. The PM will, try to do further analysis because the BA typically will go back and assess the requirements, where the changes are and things like that. And then the PM will be responsible for understanding the timelines and the budget. And the way they do that is, okay, let's just go through this first and then I can go back and explain like the entire process. So the process for the change control board is like when the CR comes in, they evaluate the impact. So in the design phase, the coding hasn't started. So typically CRs in the design phase are typically approved, right? So the only impact when the change requests come in the design phase is on the business analyst itself and no other teams. So the next steps are, if the change request is accepted, I have a question. So is there no role of product owner in this either? We're talking about the waterfall. So in the waterfall environment, there is no product owner. Okay. So let's say if in the design phase, the change request that has come in, the BA writes the new requirements, the BA adds the requirements to the BRD. The new BRD now becomes the baseline and requirements traceability matrix updates with the new requirement, okay? So what that means is a change comes in, BA does an evaluation, submits it to the PM talks to the dev teams, the QA teams, the project sponsor, their own leadership to make sure that this is a change that we want to accept. But typically, because in the design phase, it doesn't impact any other teams but rework for the BA, most of the time these change requests are approved, right? Based on our project scope. So if it's out of our project scope, it's not going to be accepted, of course. But let's say if it's aligned with our project scope and it is accepted, the BA then goes back to the requirements document. They now update the new requirements, and now they update the requirements in the traceability matrix. And now that becomes what's been approved becomes your baseline requirements. Okay. Now let's say, we're now in the implementation phase, which is when our developers or coders or programmers have started to program our project, right? So the change request comes in for the project team. We have to get that evaluated by the technical and the QA teams for scope, size, and rework if needed. And if it doesn't, again, if it's accepted, the BA updates the requirements, the technical specs need to be updated, the requirements traceability matrix needs to be updated. And then again, if it's rejected, then it gets added to the list of enhancements. Any questions over here? Let me stop for just a minute.
Sarabjit,
Yes.
in the design phase, the BA creates CR, right? So which document does he use to create the CR? So is it the
document to create the change request?
Yeah.
So there's typically a template. If you Google it, you can find lots of templates on change request templates.
So it'll be created as a Word document and then it'll be submitted to the project manager like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But typically when a change request comes in, like everybody kind of knows about it. Typically there's meetings to talk about the change request and why you need it. And if, for political reasons or whatever, you still, even if we know that it's not going to be approved, you still have to write it up and go through the political process. But typically, you're not going to create a change request form without everybody on the project team knowing about this change.
Okay.
Yeah. So typically we all talk about it. Let's say if you're the BA on the team and, the subject matter expert comes to you and says, hey, Sakanya, we have a new change and this is what it is. Typically you'll pull me aside. We'll talk about it. We'll talk to, go back to the stakeholder, understand why it's needed and all that fun stuff. So most of the time, like everybody knows about the change request before the change request is drafted.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And then go ahead, you have another question? Okay, cool. So now that we're in yes.
Sorry, I had a question
Sure.
about change request identified by SME. So could you please help me explain a little bit more detail how the SME define what is a CR and really not CR, or is it a bug or is it a CR? So could you please help me?
Sure. So CR is a change request, and typically subject matter experts are your stakeholders on the project, right? So they're the people that are giving you requirements for whatever project that you're working on. So let's say we're building Amazon, for example, right? The owner of Amazon, Jeff, I forget his last name, Bezos or whatever, would say, hey, I want to build a platform that will allow individual sellers to sell on my platform. So it's like the Walmart of Walmarts, right? Or Costco of Costco's. Anybody can come and sell on my platform. They just have to give me a fee. So let's say when we first started building Amazon, his fee was 10% of the product cost. And then as he started to see that, there's lots more people coming on and he wanted to make it more attractive, he says now, okay, instead of 10%, let's change it to 5%, right? That's a change because we've documented and we've programmed for Amazon to take 10% of project fee, price fees, like the product fees, and now he wants to change it to 5%. So that's a change. So any change that you have on your project is called a change request. And that has to get evaluated by all teams that are involved to make sure that the team with that project that we're working on can accept the change. And if we're not going to be able to accept it, then we have to add it as a enhancement for something that we work on later on. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's clear about the definition of the change request. But the question I'm asking is the who is a SME? So you are saying that the SME is a person involved on the stakeholder to define the CR, right?
Yes. So your SME are people that are giving you the requirements. On the onset of the project, those you identify who all is impacted by the project. And once you identify the departments, then you go to their management and say, who from your team can I work with on these requirements? So let's say now you, when you start a project, you have 5 departments that are impacted. From each department, you will get 1 or 2 people to be your subject matter expert. And then you work with them to gather these requirements. So when the change request comes in, you'll work with them to understand the change and assess the impact.
Okay. A little bit question, follow-up question. So you are saying about the review based on the original scope, right? So the criteria to help us to define what is a change is the original scope we are agreed before, or the user story.
So you already, when you start the project, you're like a high level scope is given to you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say for where this project is for, I don't know, if this project is for, like when you go to a doctor's office, you have like the patient onboarding screen, right? This is when they give your vitals, like your blood pressure, your glucose, your whatever, right? And that's this project is only focused on the patient onboarding when you first go to see the doctor's office. But let's say if, you know, a doctor comes along and says, you know, I want to make change to some other screen. Well, that's not in scope for this project, so we can't accept it anyway. Does that make sense? So the high level scope of a project is given to you before the project is handed over to, assigned to you as a BA. So when a change, that's actually a really, really good question. Thank you for asking that, because let's say you first as a BA have to evaluate if this change that's coming in is even part of is in scope for the project. If it's not in scope, you don't even need to involve anybody in understanding the impact because it's out of scope, right? You just toss it out. And then, right. So, but let's say if the scope that, you know, the change request that's come in is for this onboarding screen, then you have to understand based on where you are on the project, how much of an impact it is for everybody. And if it's not that big of an, and you know, I've seen changes get approved even when we're in the testing phase. So let's say we're testing and we find a huge bug or something that's not working as it's supposed to work. I have seen, you know, rework for developers, for QA, for the BA, for everybody involved, because the change is you know, critical for the business to implement. So I don't want you guys to take, you know, what we're talking about and say, if we're already testing it, we're not going to accept the change. I've seen it happen. It all depends on what the business need is.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah.
You're welcome. Okay. So now, till now we covered the implementation phase. Now the last thing is, again, testing, as I just kind of briefly talked about. Changes can still get accepted during test phase. It just depends on the business criticality of that change. But you would follow this process, you know, regardless of where the change comes in. So you're drafting it up, you're, you know, as a BA, you're getting it evaluated by the change control board, which typically is made up of, you know, management of programmers, management of the QA resources, your PM, your project sponsor, your leadership maybe, And if it is approved, then the BA has the responsibility of updating the requirements document, updating the requirements traceability to include the new change in there. The QA, the programmers will then go back and update the technical specs. There'll be rework on coding. The QA folks will go back and update their test plans, add additional stuff to the test cases. So again, the process of updating and rework starts once the change request is approved. Okay, I'm done. What questions do you guys have?
I have a question.
Okay.
Even if the new change is out of scope, does BA has the authority to say no to the business owner?
Yeah, if it's out of scope, then the BA should say, sorry, this is out of scope for this project. We can create a new project for evaluation, whatever. But yes, you do have the authority to say that.
So no need to make a change request. Change request. Okay.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if it's not clear like about it, like to whom should he check?
Your project manager.
Okay.
If
So
you're
can
not
you check-
sure, yeah, go ahead.
So can you check with the product owner? You mean to say like in Waterfall you don't have a product owner?
Okay, so product owner is only in Agile, right?
Okay.
You don't have a product owner in Waterfall.
Mhm.
In the
So-
Waterfall, you have a PM. You can talk to your PM project manager and say, this is coming in. I'm not sure whether it's in scope or out of scope. Can you help me? So they'll help you out.
Okay.
My question is, I'm still a bit confused with. I get what the change request is, and I get what something is out of scope. But I'm thinking if you say if something is out of scope, I think that's the only reason why you're implementing a change request, because it's not there. Why want it there? I don't know if I'm making any sense.
I don't understand. Can you
All right,
repeat the
what I mean by
question? Or give me a scenario.
Say like the Amazon example you gave. You want the scope is it has to be 10%. Out of saying 5% is obviously out of scope, but that's what the sponsor wants.
Okay, no. So if the sponsor comes back while we're coding the 10% and says, you know what, guys, I feel generous. I feel like I want to help people. Instead of 10%, let's make it 5%. So that's a change, right? Because in the
But
beginning,
isn't that out of scope? Isn't that also out of scope?
No. How's that out of scope?
Because the scope is it should be 10%.
No. So the scope is that we're building a platform to allow other sellers to sell on our platform.
Okay.
And part of us building a platform, Amazon has to make money, right?
Definitely.
So the guy says, okay, well, you can sell on my platform, but I'm going to charge you 10% of whatever you sell. And then while we're all BAs and, different team members are heads down working, writing requirements, coding, testing. He comes back and says, you know what, guys, I feel generous. I want to only make it 5%. So that's a change.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Any other questions? This is exciting, you guys. I love this interaction. Thank you.
I have another question.
I think you're like the most vocal. I love it. Thank you. Go ahead.
I have few doubts which I want to clear because we have still like 10 minutes left. So, okay. So I know you told.
But remember, if it's out of scope, we're not going to talk about it.
Yes, it's not out of scope. Definitely not out of scope.
Okay.
I know you mentioned that which people are involved in this change request management committee, but from the business side, is it restricted that only one person can attend this, or we can invite them? Do we invite them, or they offer that we want to be in this meeting?
So typically, again, I will never classify myself as an expert. I'm giving you my 15 years of experience plus what I've seen in this environment. So typically when the change request comes in, the business is talking to the business analyst to identify and document that change. Okay. So then what you have is this department or this like could be like a leadership person from like marketing or finance, whoever, it doesn't matter. Change request comes in, you talk to your project manager, you talk to the sponsor who's paying for the project and understand from their standpoint if this change is big enough. Typically, whoever's bringing this change on, if they have visibility into the organization, right? If they are politically savvy, they will already talk to the project sponsor, right? They'll say, hey, Joe, I want to talk to you about this new thing that we want to do because it's going to help my team save thousands of dollars each month, right? Whatever the scenario may be. So what happens is typically when this change request comes in, the sponsor kind of already has heard about it from the business folks. Then it's time for the BA and the PM, like his own team, to come in and talk to them about the impact of the change. So yes, it may save this person thousands of dollars a month, but it's gonna cost us like $100,000 to implement this change because it's so late in the game, right? Because it requires rework. The project sponsor may say no, right? So when you're making this evaluation, if you're assessing whether we're going to approve it or not approve it, we only take feedback from the teams that are involved, like the managers of the team, because they know how much work is involved in accepting this change, right? So then we take that feedback, right? The project sponsor is typically at this meeting, and we say, okay, well, it's a great change, but it's going to cost us a lot of money. What do you want to do with this? And at that point, we as a team can say, okay, it's a great change, let's do it, or we deny it, and it could be an enhancement that we work on at a later point. So again, it goes back to what is the business need? Is it critical enough, right? And it also goes back to how much is it going to cost us to deliver this change.
Okay, so we are expecting obviously the business sponsor, because he's the one who is assessing all this, and then we are expecting at least one SME under whose field it is coming.
Yeah.
Who's directly affected basically by it.
Yes.
Okay, so at least two people from business side.
Not at the change control board. They could be invited to talk about their change, right, to the meeting, but sometimes they're not.
Sometimes there is only one person because they may have talked in between.
So sometimes we don't even invite the business folks.
I see. It is just our internal team.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because this is a decision that you're trying to make so yeah, you can invite this project sponsor to talk about the change, and so everybody has a clear understanding, blah blah blah, but sometimes you don't even need to. Like the change control board is going to be people who are assessing this change and understanding whether it's needed or not.
So it just depends.
Yeah, every company is different, so it all depends on the company culture.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a new question. So I'm gonna talking about the CR, another type of CR when it's happened in the testing phase. So when testing phase, when the QA finds some bug and we need to change the logic or change something minor change to adapt with the critical. So it means it's just an internal CR to make the flow, business flow to become logically. So how can we face for this situation? So should we propose to the SME or we just leave it internal work efforts?
So if it doesn't impact the business, if the business doesn't see it, right? Like if it's a change on the back end, right? Typically
Mm-hmm.
there's things that are customer facing and then there's things that are like on the back end, right? So if it's
Mm-hmm.
not impacting the customer in any way, you don't go back to this subject matter expert. You log it as a defect, you work with your developers, you update the technical specs to identify the changes been done, right? But there's no need to go back to the end user because, I mean, even if you tell them, they're not gonna see the changes on the front end. So if it's a defect, then it only impacts the back end. You work with your developers to get that fixed, to log it as a defect, to update your documentation and fix it.
Okay, this makes sense. But whenever the back end fixing is effect to the end user, we still need to tell them that.
Yes, you go back and you tell them what is going to be different. You follow. Okay, so if it's a defect that is logged, right? So the requirements were there, I guess, but it's so it's only a defect if the requirements were clear enough, right? And it was coded wrong, right?
Okay.
But if it's while we're testing it, we identify the requirements were clear, but it's not working as it needs to be, like as it was designed. Then again, you go into the change control process, which is understanding from the business what needs to be done, what how is it working today, how does it need to be. You work with everybody to make sure that what rework is needed, and then you evaluate, do we want to make this change right now, or can the business live with it? And if you cannot make this change right now, you try to identify workarounds for the business until you can get it fixed.
Okay, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Okay, awesome. This was really great, you guys. Thank you so much for joining and thank you for the interaction, because otherwise, like, I think if I was talking to myself, I wouldn't be doing this every weekend. So thank you for joining. Thank you for making the time.